Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 5 of the course. We're officially 1/3 of the way done. Just want to let you know that quiz 2 will be available this Friday, and it'll be available from about noon on Friday until midnight on Saturday night. And the quiz will be open book. You can use your notes. You can go back and reference the videos if you want to. And it'll cover the stuff essentially that we've talked about from the beginning of the semester up until this point. I'm not going to include the stuff that we're reading this week on republicanism and Jefferson and things like that. So just stuff up until this week will be on the quiz. It'll be a combination of 10 multiple choice true-false questions. So if anybody has any issues with that, shoot me an email and we may be able to work something out. Okay, so last week, the discussion, we looked at federalism and anti-federalism, right? The debate over federalism and a strong national government versus the state powers, and how the government tried to institute, some of the rights that were laid out in the Declaration of Independence, and how to manage, this new entity that arose out of the Revolutionary War. So, as many of you referenced in the discussion, as you know, the initial attempt to try to make a government was the Articles of Confederation, right? And essentially, under the Articles of Confederation, there were very limited powers given to a national government. There was actually a national Congress, which had one representative from each colony or each state. But they didn't have power to tax, was the main problem that they had. They were tasked with sort of providing for the national defense, but they couldn't. They essentially relied on money from the states to actually raise an army. So sometimes the states would give money and sometimes they wouldn't. It's sort of similar to, if you want to compare it to something, you compare it to the United Nations of today, right? It sort of has these grand ambitions of being a type of global governance system, but it really doesn't have any sovereignty, right? Because they're dependent upon the member nations to give them troops and resources and things like that. So that's kind of the way the government was under the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't regulate interstate commerce, which was a really big deal, because as we'll talk about a little bit, the founders, the framers of the Constitution, were, for the most part, very wealthy, and and at least in the case of the Northerners, were merchants, right? So they were looking to find ways to make sure that they could conduct their business more securely and don't have to worry about some of the issues that come up from interstate commerce and the challenges of that. So, the motivation behind the Constitution was not all ideology, right? A lot of it was, and most of it actually was practical considerations for these guys. So they weren't happy with the Articles of Confederation. So initially they were going to, they had a meeting in Annapolis where they were talking, sort of some delegates got together and were talking about, delegates from this original Congress were talking about, ways they could modify the Articles. And they said, well, let's have this convention in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention. It's in 1787, where we're going to get together and we're going to discuss ways that we can modify the Articles of Confederation. But in actuality, they were going in to create an entire new governing document. But they didn't tell anybody this, right? And that's something that the delegates were actually sworn to secrecy, right? They couldn't relay what was happening at the convention, to their families, to their friends, or whatever. They were supposed to do it in chambers, which provided them with a lot of latitude to do things that they couldn't have done. They couldn't. You couldn't. It would be much more difficult to do something like that today, right? Because the media would be all over it, social media. So everything that they had done would have been scrutinized. And essentially, what they were doing was carrying out another revolution, right? They were overthrowing another government. They were overthrowing a government that had been put in place by the Articles of Confederation. So Madison, right? James Madison, sort of the the architect of the Constitution, the architect of the Constitutional Convention. He came to the convention with a plan, right? And what became known as the Virginia Plan, or the Large State Plan, right, where essentially representation in the new Congress would be based upon the size of the states. And the smaller states had trouble with this, right? So the New Jersey came back with the New Jersey Plan, which essentially said that there should be equal representation, like it currently already was in the existing Congress. And then that's when this whole Connecticut Compromise thing happened, which created sort of the legislative system that we have now, where we have one body that is based on representation, size, and one that's based upon sort of equal representation. So that's kind of how we got to this bicameral system that we have. But yeah, so these guys were wealthy, right? They came together. And this whole notion of, like, we're talking about, individual liberty and democracy and things like that. It's important to keep in mind that the ideals that are laid out in the Declaration of Independence weren't necessarily the ideals that the framers of the Constitution actually had. They did to a degree, but it wasn't individual liberty that really motivated the framers of the Constitution. What they were trying to do was trying to create a national government that, for one, could actually function, right, but could function to protect the interests of, the white males who owned property, right? So according to them, that was the key thing that tied people actually into being interested in the government, was the fact that they owned property. And going back to John Locke, life, liberty, and property, the purpose of government is the protection of property. So it makes sense in a way that the government would be set up to protect those people with property, according to their line of thinking, right? So that's what they were setting out to do, right? And it's important, of course, to keep in mind this distinction between, a republic and a democracy, right? Because there are lots of things about the original Constitution that are not democratic, right? I mean, the senators were not going to be publicly elected, right? That didn't come until much later in the 20th century. So, this most representative body was actually supposed to come from, going to be nominated by state legislators and approved by the House of Representatives. So, not very democratic. The Electoral College, another thing that obviously was not democratic, right? So, because these guys did not trust. I mean, the Constitution is a document that is essentially created out of believing that man cannot be trusted, right? Man is a selfish animal who pursues his own interests, and the way to control that is to create this governing system that can actually keep man's self-interest and greed and avarice in check, which is essentially the purpose of the Constitution, right? And that's why, you have the checks and balances. And, I mean, it works, right? I mean, it's, at least partially it works. But it was a great system that was created. But it's not based upon this ideology that all men are created equal, everybody has equal rights and equal liberties. It's based on the fact that man is a selfish creature, and we have to put into place government to keep man in check. James Madison said, in the Federalist Papers, he said that, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So that's sort of the ideology behind the Constitution. Okay, so they sort of come to agreement on this Constitution. They leave, and then they put this document out there and say, okay, now this needs to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. So that's when this big debate occurs between the Federalists, as we can see sort of in the Federalist Papers, and the Anti-Federalists. So as you can imagine, when the Constitution, the new Constitution came out, there was a lot of opposition to it, and that was in the guise of the Anti-Federalists. Right now, there are no Anti-Federalist papers like there's a Federalist Papers, but there were a collection of people, very prominent people who were writing essays, against the Constitution as it was currently set out. Right, so Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, Robert Yates, probably the most prominent one, the one that we read from in the Essays of Brutus. So a whole collection of these, sort of throughout the various states responding to the Constitution, right? So this happens. Madison and Hamilton and Jay are very strategic, and they say, okay, well, we need to get together and we need to put together a very solid defense of the principles that are laid out in the Constitution. Strong executive, separation of power, right? Checks and balances, all these things. So they do that. They get together and they write the Federalist Papers, and they publish it under the guise of Publius, which means friend of the people, right? So these names were very strategically chosen, friend of the people, right? So and then Brutus, of course, the most noble of Romans, right, who opposes the tyranny of Caesar. So he's saying, in this case, this looks like there may be another tyranny coming to power here in the guise of the national government. So Brutus, Yeats takes on the role of Brutus. So yeah, the question I asked you guys to consider in the discussion last week was, what did they see? What was the major points of contention? And there are a lot, but I pointed to two specific ones in the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, right? So essentially, I guess we should start with, a definition of federalism, because it's a term that's often misunderstood, right? A lot of people, when they hear the word federal government, they're thinking about a strong national government, when in fact a federal system is a system that separates power between a national government and its constituent parts. So in this case, sovereignty is separated between the national government and the state governments. And this was sort of an unheard of an unheard of method of governing up until this point, right? People just couldn't understand, well, how can you have, two sovereign bodies, right? It's kind of confusing. So right there we're doing something different, right? So anyway, federalism, sovereignty is divided between a national body and the states, right? And it's interesting too that the anti-federalists were known as the anti-federalists, right? Because in fact, what the anti-federalists were actually proposing was that there needed to be strong state governments to keep the national government in check. So in a way, you could even call the anti-federalists the true federalists, because they had a very, divided sovereignty idea in mind, right? But the Federalists obviously were arguing for a much stronger national government. I mean, that was the thing, right? Hamilton lays it out pretty early when he says, look, we say that we want to give the U.S. government, it has these purposes, right? To provide for the general welfare, to provide for the security of the country, right? To regulate commerce between the different states. You can't tell us to do these things and not give us the power to carry them out, right? So that was the point of the Constitution, was to say, okay, what kind of government? Here's what we say we're going to do. What kinds of powers and systems do we actually need in place to carry out those ends, right? So they created this sort of strong national power, right? But so the anti-federalists come back and say, okay, wait, hold up. You say that, so one thing that's confusing is this notion of providing for the general welfare, right? That is very broad, right? So there's sort of any kind of action you want to take could perhaps be interpreted as providing for the general welfare, right? So you're saying that we have to give you the means to provide for the general welfare, but the general welfare could mean anything, right? It's not very specific. So the powers need to be explicitly laid out, right? So, and Brutus argues in another essay, he's like, look, so if you have the power, which is another big part of the Constitution, right? You have the power to lay taxes, to make taxes, to provide for the general welfare, right? And you also have the power, if there's a conflict between state and federal taxes, to sort of abolish the state tax and make sure the federal tax is actually the one that's being paid, right? Because if you're asking citizens to pay taxes on two things, like an income tax in some states, not in Florida, but in some states, my former state, Virginia, you have to pay a federal income tax and you have to pay a state income tax, right? And that can become very burdensome on people when they have to pay it twice. And of course, the deal is that another thing that the federal government or the national government has is a military, right? They have the right to raise a military, so they have they essentially have all the guns, or all the, most of them anyway. At least, according to the original formulation, they did have them all primarily, right? Because there was no Second Amendment. But yeah, so they have the power, right? So they do what they want, right? At the end of the day. So these guys say, wait, look, your means, at least your ends that are laid out are way too broad. They give you way too much power if you want to say you have you need the means to carry out those ends, right? And, they also say, look, states have ends as well. So you have to give us the means to carry those out too, right? So there's this whole debate about, the encroachment of national power laid out in the Constitution on the states, and also the encroachment of power on individual liberties, which is what supposedly this whole thing was supposed to be about, right? At least that's what they say in the Declaration of Independence, and that's what we've been fighting for, right? And all these states throughout this nation have bills of rights in their constitutions. So why does the national constitution not have a bill of rights in it? It doesn't make sense. And then Yates talks about, he considers, maybe they overlooked it, right? And he's like, but no. There are certain things like that they talk about in the Constitution, like the writ of habeas corpus should not be suspended, right? And bills of attainder should not be put into place, right? So there are certain things where they did mention specific individual liberties that need to be protected, right? So habeas corpus, in case you guys don't know, is just a body of laws, right? It means that there's a body of laws that need to be followed to protect individuals, and that should not be suspended, right? So there are some that they did say, okay, we need to protect that, but they did not include an explicit Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, things like that. So Yates, in essay 2 that I had you guys look at, makes a pretty strong case. He says that a Bill of Rights is absolutely necessary. If you're going to put forward this kind of document, there has to be a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. Otherwise, the national government is just going to do whatever they want and step all over our liberties. Later he goes on to say, look, that may not even be sufficient. The fact that we have a Bill of Rights may not be sufficient to prevent the encroachment of national power, but it is necessary. You have to do it. So, so the thing for the Federalists, where I had you guys look at, where Madison was talking about the greatest threat to sort of this kind of national Republican government, according to Madison, were these factions, right? And you have to remember that at the time that the Constitution was being written, and slightly before, there was something going on called Shays' Rebellion, right? And that's where a group of angry citizens got together, and a lot of them were Revolutionary War veterans because of, economic stagnation, depression, all the things that, that we go through, right? I mean, the challenges that we face even today. If there were no strong national power, Madison argued, to keep those forces in check, those forces that rise up, then there's no way the government can work, right? And it's just going to be one Shays' Rebellion after another, and it's going to be dog eat dog, essentially, until some, major party power comes to party and it turns into another tyranny, right? It turns into another dictatorship or something like that. So Madison, as you guys rightly pointed this out, he said, there are two solutions to the faction problem, right? You can either remove its cause or you can handle the effect of it, right? Control the effect. And he says that the cause of factions is liberty, right? So if you're in a democratic society and people have liberty, they're going to arrive at their own conclusions, and they have the right to assemble, right? Then you can't cut out special interest groups and factions without curtailing individual liberty. Or he said the other possibility is just make sure everybody agrees on everything, right? Which we know is ridiculous, right? People have their own minds. That's that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness thing we were talking about. So they're going to come to their own conclusions, and if they have the right to assemble, they're going to form coalitions or factions. So that's out, right? We can't do that. So Madison says, okay, so what can we do? How can we control the effects? Well, he says one thing we can do is have this federal system, that separates power in different ways, right? And make sure that, we have a representative government, right, that can actually control these factions. So, we have several safeguards to prevent these factions from gaining power, right? So maybe they gain power in a municipality, but there's the state government there put in place to control them, right? And even if they got control of a state, it would be very hard for them to try to form, a coalition among other states, right? So you have all these sort of layers of insulation preventing the factions from gaining power. So that's one way Madison said you can do it. Another point that he made was by having a very large republic or a large country, you're going to sort of dissipate the amount of influence that these interest groups have, because it's much harder, especially when they're spread out. So for one thing, they're going to have different interests. A faction in Colorado is going to have probably a very different interest than a faction in Virginia, right? So you have all these sort of different factions out there, and they can't really consolidate their power, right? Which an interesting question to think about is that true today, right? Is the geographic argument that Madison uses about having a large republic and sort of spreading out the power of all these factions across, these vast geographic areas, is that still true today with the internet and modern technology? Probably not, right? So that was Madison's chief concern, right? And Hamilton as well, talking about how these factions, especially in a democratic society, are going to form. And the question is, once again, going back to this notion of man's base nature, how do you control it? The same way that, as we all know, right, in the Constitution, you have separation of powers, you have a federal system, you have checks and balances. You have all these things put into place to control these factions. Plus, you live in a very vast country where the interests are so spread out, it's hard for them to actually gain enough traction to come to national prominence, right? And then Brutus, is concerned, of course, about states' rights and ultimately individual rights. So the compromise that they reached was that they ratified the Constitution, obviously, with the Bill of Rights. And one of the most important amendments has to do with the limitations on the national power, right? Where it says if it's not expressed explicitly, if the power is not explicitly given to the federal government by this Constitution, then all the rest of the powers reside with the states themselves, right? So that's actually a huge clause in this government trying to keep sort of the national power from encroaching on the state powers. But we see that it still happens in a lot of ways. But that's where the Supreme Court is supposed to step in, and they do in many cases, and say, even Obamacare, right? The Affordable Care Act is under review to look at whether the way they have this sort of health care subsidy set up, whether it infringes upon the state's rights or not. And if it does, it's unconstitutional. So the two compromises they arrived at, of course, was the Bill of Rights and then this implied power amendment, which said, look, if we don't say it in the Constitution, the power resides with the states. Okay, so that's just a brief down and dirty. We could spend an entire semester talking about this, but because this is sort of a survey course, we're moving on. This week we're looking at probably you could call it the anti-federalists under another guise, right? Republicanism, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, and sort of the way they respond to the strong national government Federalist debate. So pay close attention when you're reading Jefferson's first inaugural address, his objection to the national bank being put into place, and listen to the iTunes podcast. And I'll be posting the discussion question tomorrow. Don't forget that quiz 2 is going to be open on Friday and it's going to close Saturday midnight. If you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Have a good week.